Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan from startups.com, joined as ever by Wil Schroeder, my friend, the founder and CEO of startups.com. Wil, today we're going to talk about something that a lot of founders get a little bit twisted, I think. You know, we always talk about celebrating little victories, right?
Right.
And making sure that, you know, the little things don't go missed, and that, you know, you need those things to kind of keep the energy and the morale of the team up. And speaking specifically of team, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. And we also have to be pretty careful about like what we actually consider a victory, right? A lot of people use staff count and the inflation and growth of staff count as like some measure for success. And to some degree, that's true. If you've got a basketball team and you've got one player, hiring 4 more people be a great idea, right? It's sort of necessary to play the game. However, in the case of the startup, I think that this gets confused a lot, and we start to focus on head count as opposed to some other really, really important factors. What's your take?
Look, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that should ever truly be celebrated in an organization is revenue.
Yes.
Now, again, but we talked about celebrating the small wins, right? And so hiring somebody is exciting, feels like a victory. Getting new office space back when people used to get office space, you know, feels like a victory. And we've all celebrated those things, right? They're fun. They feel like building blocks on a greater journey, and I think that's wonderful. What we're really talking about, and what we'll dig into today, is how that celebration gets confused with success. Right? Anyone can spend money. That's not the hard part. It's getting the revenue behind it. But I think what would be worth digging into today is to talk about why we should be maybe a little bit more hesitant and gun shy when we're thinking about celebrating staffing and some of the kind of challenges and pitfalls that come with it. Because I think if we've never done it before, maybe we've raised a round of money, and now we're like, hey, we're hiring all these people, and there's an article about us that we're adding 50 people or 100 people or whatever it is, that sounds like this company must be doing well.
Right.
But it's not. Right? That does not mean you're doing well.
They've just added a whole bunch of overhead is what actually happened. A whole bunch of payroll tax, a whole bunch of additional headaches within culture and strain on the management team, and all sorts of other really not fun things are happening as a result of that.
All right, so before we get into this next topic, I just want to let you know what we talk about here is like 1% of the conversation. You know, really this conversation is going on all day long online at groups.startups.com, where Ryan and I pretty much talk endlessly with founders about every one of these topics. So if by the end of this discussion, you like the topic and you want to dig into it a little bit more with Ryan and I, just head to groups.startups.com and we'll pick it up from there. Right. And I kind of stole this from some other use case, but I always say that celebrating staffing is like celebrating the cost of a wedding, right? That's not what you should be celebrating. You should be celebrating the outcome, which is revenue, right? So it's very different. And so I guess to kick it off, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we look at staffing, Ryan, right? So when you and I sit down, and we're adding more folks now, we've got a founder group product, and that product's growing very fast, and we need lots of people to add to that. But walk me through, when you see us, you know, open up all these different hires, what goes through your mind? You know, kind of how do you calibrate? You know, are you looking at that as we made it? Are you looking at that as, oh shit, now we have all these people we have to deal with? Walk me through it.
You know, it's a bit of both. Of course, in a product where humans are required and are kind of keystone to scaling, right? So like there's no version of us running founders group with 1,000 groups and one moderator, one coordinator, one onboarding person, right? So it is an indicator that we're growing. And so of course I'm always happy to see that growth. But the way it works in reality, it's kind of like in manufacturing, right? You manufacture and you got a machine that's capable of putting out 100 widgets. And now you've got an order for 105 widgets. And now you need a whole nother machine, but you only need 5 more widgets. So it always comes back to like, what's the break even time on this going to be, right? Even when it's really clear, right? So, and sometimes it's not, right? Depending on the hire, sometimes it can be really nebulous as to exactly what the ROI on the individual is. In this case, we know we're solving a capacity issue. And so there is a very specific ROI on that. So then it becomes a matter of time. So my mind first jumps to the P&L and, right, how much of a deficit that particular group's going to be operating at for how long of a time. What do we need to do on the marketing side to try to make up for that, right? So then it turns from a simple like, hey, we added somebody, into the calculus of when does that somebody no longer just a cost burden, and when are they participating in a way that actually benefits the company, in this case specifically financially, monetarily.
When a founder says to me, "We're about to staff up," my first reaction, even though I don't express this, is I'm sorry for your loss. And when I say that, what I'm saying is I'm sorry for your loss of efficiency. I'm sorry for
Yeah.
your loss of capital. I'm sorry for your
Yep.
loss of culture. I'm sorry. All these things that are a massive groundswell of liability that most, especially first-time founders, aren't aware of. Now, it's also
That's
the
great.
cost of doing business, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the end of it. I think where we get held up as founders and the whole team really is that we see this as progress, but we only see it as progress, right?
That's right.
The way over the years we saw building giant industrial complexes and building cars as progress, we didn't understand there's some residual damage to all that progress, right? It wasn't good
That's
for everybody
correct.
all the time. And so
Yeah.
I get anxious when we look at staffing and growth through staffing in this one-dimensional lens. And so let's talk a little bit about all the strains it puts on the organization and why adding those strains aren't always recoverable, right? So
Sure.
what are the things that come to mind first for you?
Yeah, so like the financial strain is often recoverable, right? So we can kind of jump over that one. I mean, in theory, it should be at least, right? At some point, there
If you make
should be
revenue.
ROI on the individual, right? So like there's some way that they're impacting revenue. So we kind of jump over that one. Management strain, right, doesn't go away, right? As you continue to add people, it's not like, well, okay, there's more of a burden up front, which is true, but there will be permanent additional management strain. There's one more person, two more people, three more people, four more people, whatever it ends up being, that manager, that leader has to lead and manage.
Right.
And that doesn't go away, and it doesn't get reduced until you hire another manager, right? So we're right back into, we're kind of chasing our tails on this one. So I think that's a big part of it. Company culture definitely changes with hiring.
First casualty.
Right. And, we've definitely had cases where there were hires where they were bad cultural fits. And we've done an entire episode on like our stance around this, our ethos as a company.
Sure.
And where we stand on this. We've done a full episode on that. So if you really want to understand, how we feel about culture and hiring, skip back to that episode. It's a really good one. However, what I will say is we've also made hires where they were absolutely cultural gems, right? And they're people who do augment the organization. So this one isn't always a cost specifically to culture, but what I will say is that as a general rule, the bigger the company gets, the more amorphous the culture gets, right?
Correct.
The
By
more
definition.
cliquey it can get, right? You end up with like fractionalized culture. You end up with, team-based cultures. And not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but from a leadership perspective, it's a big burden, right? Because you're still responsible for overall culture. And now you're managing what might be 5, 6, 7 distinct cultures within an organization and trying to somehow make that into a cohesive blend that actually works better together. So those two are the kind of the top two for me in terms of what the cost of hiring is. And that's the increased management burden and the change in culture, which of course feeds back to that management burden because ultimately it's reliant on the managers to make sure that lands as well as it can.
Sure. What kills me is efficiency, right?
For sure.
We had 10 people in a room, and the important part, in a room. At
In
any
our
given
room,
time, at that moment, let's say before we took on venture capital, if we wanted to make a hard right turn right now, everybody turns their chairs, faces inward, we give a little pep talk speech, and make the hard right turn. That's it.
Here we go.
That's the change,
That's
right?
all it took.
And now we've raised a bunch of money. Now we plan on having 100 people, right? And we're like, oh, but it's gonna be a little bit harder to do. Actually, a lot harder to do. Because by the way, not everyone agrees with what we're doing. Not everyone cares about what we're doing, right? Not everybody wants to work harder based on this new, genius idea we had 9 seconds ago. And so, whereas before we were tight, we were efficient, now all of a sudden, every person we add decreases our efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Decreases our ability to communicate and get everybody on board with what we want to do. We don't see it though. At the time, we raise a big round, let's say, and we add all these people. And in our mind, now we can get more done. And theoretically, that's true. And again, we're not anti-staffing. What we're saying is you have to realize what the true costs of adding more people are. And it's and again, adding more people isn't the success metric.
Will, you said something that I want to circle back to,
Sure.
and that was it was part and parcel with the efficiency, but engagement is a big piece of this. And you were saying that, like, maybe you don't care as much, and that's the point I want to ping on. If you're employee 4, the chances are you're bought into the mission because that's probably all that's being sold at that point, right? Like, it's the vision and the mission, right? The company has no cash, it has no staff, it has nothing, right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
You're really bought into why this business is doing what it's doing, and you want to be part of that, right? By the time you're employee 200, 500, not to say that engaged employees and the rock stars don't come along at employees 200 and 500, they do. However, the likelihood of that becomes less and less and less, right? The further you are away from kind of like mission critical stuff, if you're the 7th dev on the 4th product team, your buy-in level is probably not the same as the person who coded the MVP of this thing and is now the CTO, right? Like, by nature, by definition, the engagement level, the buy-in there is very, very different. And so I think that speaks to a couple of things. One, just the engagement overall, but to your point around efficiency, there's kind of a declining curve there, right? Like, as there's a diminishing return on all these additional hires, the likelihood that we're getting that same level of buy-in, that same level of efficiency out of an individual reduces. And then there's the organizational efficiency, which is, I think, what you were speaking to.
Right.
Now we've got multiple people that are supposed to be doing the same kind of things. Are they doing them at the same pace? Is there a rate limiting factor? Is somebody holding up an entire team? All sorts of stuff starts to happen. And again, it's managerial burden, right? It just falls back on the leadership team and the management team to say, how do we make the most out of all of these parts we have, particularly as we keep adding parts as we're rolling down the road? And it's really tough.
Well, you said something that I think is interesting. Think of the dilution that comes. Like, this is, the commonly held thing is that A's hire A's and B's, B's hire C's, C's hire D's, etc. So by definition, as we grow, we get a dilution of quality. Now, some people say, no, we got more money now, we're going to hire quality across the board. You're going to hire quality across the board, right?
Yeah.
But employee 58 has no idea what quality means compared to you. Or, like you said, buy-in, and all these things start to tie together. And so as more and more people get added to the roster, the quality, the consistent quality, starts to inherently dilute. Because if Ryan, if you hire me and you're 100 and I'm a 90 and I hire an 80, it doesn't take very long, because at first everybody seems pretty good, right?
Yep.
But it doesn't take very long to get down to 10.
Yeah.
And what happens is, as we grow this thing, we lose sight of that. We lose sight of how powerful dilution is in an organization. And you rarely hear someone at any level say, let's audit where we are down the line and see if the last hire we made is as good as the 10th hire we made, right? And compare that. You should, but nobody really does.
That would be interesting, but nobody does that. I mean, certainly anecdotally, we make comparisons, right?
Sure.
It happens all the time. Like, geez, it'd be amazing if they hustled as much as so-and-so, or, oh gosh, I'm really glad we hired this person, and they're 2Xing what the person who was in that seat before them did. Happens, right? And we talk about it in that sense. But in terms of like a really objective breakdown and analysis, we've never done anything like that.
And all of these are collectively the costs that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because I think everybody, when they hear cost, they just think dollars. And the dollars matter. We're definitely not overlooking that aspect of it. But the dollars are just one piece of it. We know instinctively, and we'll see this if we haven't seen it yet, that as each new person comes in, they are a burden. They are a cost, right? They're probably wonderful too, right? They're probably fun at parties, right? I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying, as founders and the managing team, as we look down the line at all of these things that right now we're celebrating, we've got to really understand what the hell we're celebrating.
Right.
Hey, oh my God, we're growing so fast, so we're adding so many people. Okay, what is that about to cost us? And
Right.
and if we just keep thinking that every person we bring on, that next person in headcount is a net positive, we're totally overlooking what happens when you staff up. We'll find out about it later. I
That's right.
guarantee that.
Yep. We'll
But we're
see how
overlooking
it
it
plays
now.
out.
By the way, I just want to mention, if what we're talking about today sounds like the kind of discussion you wish you were having more often, you actually can. We're online all day, every day, working through exactly these types of topics with founders just like you. So any question you would have, or maybe some problem you just want to work through, we're here and we love this stuff. And we're easy to find. Head over to groups.startups.com and let's just start talking.
Yeah, let's talk for a minute about why this occurs, right?
Sure.
Why we're willing to take on these costs. I think this is always important. This is startup therapy, so we got to get into the feels here a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about why we associate hiring people with growth, with great outcomes, and it really is. A lot of it is an emotional decision. It's an emotional feeling, right? And it's some of it. I remember early on, some of it just felt like adding troops to the front line. I felt like I was insulating myself a little bit.
Sure.
Right. It went from being a team of 3 to being a team of 15. There felt like some defense and insulation there, right? I now have a front line, right? I'm not in this by myself. So just by virtue of just adding bodies, I felt safer in some ways.
I could see that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that was a good feeling. Right now, watching those people perform poorly or well obviously changes how I feel about it after the fact. But in the moment, just adding that person felt good. Also, we tend to be happy about the hires we make, right? We go through this process. There's vetting. There's multiple candidates, ideally. There's multiple great choices. And then you get to pick somebody at the end. And that feels great, right? There's a real euphoric high around making that decision in most cases. Now, sometimes, you got desperation hires and things like that. We're just we've just got to fill seats. We need people to answer phones. We need people to code, whatever it is.
Right.
But in the vast majority of cases, it does feel kind of like welcoming a new member to the family, right? New baby arrived or somebody married into the family and you like them. It feels good. And so I think this is part of where we start to fool ourselves a little bit and obscure the cost and willingly kind of push aside what the real impact of this is going to be for the business.
Sure.
Because it feels good, right? And I'm not sure you may have some other thoughts on that as well, but I didn't want to move on beyond the cost without talking about why and how we're willing to do this to ourselves.
It's validation that we're doing something positive, and the reinforcement of that validation comes from everywhere, right?
Yes.
The media writes about it. Even the government gets it. Our local government's going to talk about how many jobs we created.
It's all they focus on. It's their key stat. It's their only stat, right?
Yeah. It pays taxes. But everyone around us, high fives us for this. Imagine for a second, right? We actually just changed what we were taking the liability on. And we were saying we just took on more debt, right? And we're running around looking for that high five, and nobody's giving it to us, right? Just took out another credit card, just took out another loan, and it's all going to go toward growth. And everyone's like, you have to pay that back, right?
Right.
That's a huge liability, right? No, it's a sign of growth. People said yes, they're giving me money, and it's you kind of got to pay all that back.
Yes and no.
And so I think what happens is you're sitting in that interview, or you're sitting across from one of your peers, you're talking to the media. And they're telling you how great it is that that you're validated by the fact that you're adding more staff, and it feels good, like you said, right? So you get behind it, and more people are joining your cause, and of course that feels good, right? You probably just got funded, and you totally overlooked that liability, and they said yes. The investor said yes, and they gave you the money, and you must be good. You've again totally overlooked the liability that comes with it, and that's part of the job, by the way.
It is,
but I think where we get led astray is we start thinking about creating liabilities as wins.
Yeah.
And the truth is, while they are necessary evils, they're debts. Revenue's a win. Everything else is a debt. Everything else is a necessary evil and debt to get to revenue if we have to. But we haven't won shit until we get the revenue.
Exactly. Yeah. So this brings us to another point. So like in terms of talking about like you brought up that like A's hire B's, B's hire C's, C's hire D's. And that's the kind of anybody's capable of hiring a human, right? It doesn't take any particular skill. I'm reminded of the first time I decided to let somebody in my first company make a hiring decision. And boy, was that scary. I don't know if you remember that, Will, but holy hell was I nervous about the decision they were about to make. And all I asked was that they come to me with their final 3 candidates and talk me through them. And I was still going to let them decide. I decided to give full responsibility here. It felt like an important step in the company. I just wanted to hear about them and understand why out of the top 3, which one they were finally going to choose, which secretly was going to decide whether I ever let this person hire anyone else again. Didn't tell them that. But I remember he came to me with these 3 candidates, and he was like, he's so excited to work for us. He loves the mission. He knows, every client that we've worked with. He's made some suggestions already. Like he's really, really into what we're doing. He loves the space, and kept going on and on about how much this person loved us. And at some point I couldn't help myself. I told myself I was just going to be quiet and kind of listen. At some point I was like, okay, what do we like them? Do we want to hire him? Like, are we as excited about him as he is about us? And it was just like deer in the headlights look around like, I kind of forgotten about that part. Let me go back and get you a new top 3 captain. But which just points out, right? Like, and again, nothing against Dave or the candidate, because we did ultimately end up hiring this person. They were a great fit. But that was not apparent from the information that was being passed, nor had enough diligence been done on that side. It was just like, we were excited about them because they were excited about us. I'm like, we're gonna need a little more than that before we say yes. And I think we can easily forget that, right? That there isn't anything particularly difficult about hiring people. It's particularly difficult to hire the right people. Almost as difficult it is for me to say difficult today for some reason. But it's just not that hard to hire people, right?
Well, actually, hold on. Let me modify that because you and I have hired a lot of people. It's challenging. There's a tremendous amount of friction to it. What we're saying is hiring them, saying yes, and putting them on payroll is the easy part.
Yes.
Paying for payroll is the harder part.
Yeah, that's different. Totally different.
And so I think, let's say, again, we raise a bunch of money. I'm using this as an example, not because for or against raising money, just more because it's a single event that tends to charge this decision kind of at one time. And so we get this big check, and we said we got 20 open hires, and everybody's high-fiving about, what's about to happen. And we start to think, oh my gosh, it's so hard to find people, and we're looking at all these sources and trying to find the right people, and it's so competitive, et cetera. So this must mean we're accomplishing something. And we are, of course. This is all part of how we grow a business. What we lose sight of is, okay, I finally found 4 engineers. Awesome. That was the easy part.
Right.
Getting the productivity out of those 4 engineers, right? Getting the ROI, getting our product to market so we can sell what those engineers are supposed to do, to get all that money back so that we can pay for them. That's what we should be celebrating. That's where our focus should be, right?
Do we have a plan for that? We could at least celebrate the plan. Right?
Well, think of how many startups wind up having a tremendous amount of time and friction invested in building these staffs, raising money, et cetera, but never get to the point where they make any money, right? What I think we're suggesting here is we're not discounting how challenging all these things are. What we're saying is, let's keep our head about us. Let's look at when we have the friction of hiring people and saying, look, anybody can spend money. Like, we just got a bunch from an investor. It's not hard to spend their money, right? Let's look at every choice we're about to make as a massive liability, not just a massive step forward. and look at that and say, not that we're not going to do it, but are we sure that for all the liability that we're about to take on, that we can back it up, right?
Right.
I think it's just a change in mindset.
Yeah, man. I mean, what we're really saying here is that staffing isn't the victory, right? It's not the validation. Like revenue is the validation, right? We have to have some plan for how all of this stuff gets us there, or it doesn't really matter. It'd be kind of like celebrating having an office, but not having a product or a team or anything to fill it, and being like, we got the office and a logo. We're
I'm
most
sure
of
that's
the way
happened
there.
before.
Yeah, it definitely has. It's not really the victory you want to celebrate, right?
Well, and look, in my mind, again, when a friend comes to me and says, "Hey, just raise some money," or "We're just about to hire, 50 people," I always try to say, "Okay, cool. That's the easy part." And again, here's what's weird: nobody thinks about it as the easy part at the time because they don't have it, right? I mean, just went through maybe a fundraise that was hard. It is hard.
Yep.
And now they're going through staffing, which is super complex. But I said, look, eyes on the prize, guys. We go through this ourselves at startups.com. We hire a lot of people. And when we look at it, we pour over every single decision, right? We may have a couple hundred people and figure we have turnovers, so we're replacing people, et cetera. But I got to tell you, not a single decision we make is made lightly. And we think about every single cost that it implies. And what I think we're kind of known for doing, certainly internally, is saying, how do we add as few people as possible? Because here's what we're saying.
Yeah.
We're saying we want to make revenue. We like that part of the business.
Yep.
But we don't necessarily want to add a ton of staff to get it. So what can we do to keep revenue going, but be more efficient with our staff, right? And I think what that does, it's made us a really healthy business.
Yeah.
And I've looked at other businesses in the past that have kind of had that mantra. Craigslist comes to mind. Craig Newmark told me years ago, he said, we look at every single hire as a massive liability to be avoided. And by way of that, I mean, they built like a $200 million company with like 50 people, right? And to me, that's amazing because the focus isn't on size, it's on efficiency.
That's right. It's about being a better company, not a bigger company.
Right. And then we look at it and say, we don't want to be the biggest company by virtue of headcount, right? Actually, that brings me no pleasure. When I say we have 200 people, we have 200 people and they're all great. And if you're listening, we love you. I don't want to take this wrong, but like we have 200 mouths to feed. That's a lot of liability. Right. And I think about it every single night. And no part of me is like, I wish we could be 400 people.
How do we double that? Yeah.
Twice. That'd be like actually 10 times as much liability if you really think about it. But I look at all this growth and I say, I want growth. I don't want to pay for it in headcount, right? I want to pay for it in efficiency. I want to be able to say, if we can do it with 2 developers, let's do it with 2 developers. I don't want a team of 20 people in hopes that maybe that'll somehow magically turn into ROI. If we're funding a company, if we're growing a company, right, I want you and I to be super, diligent about saying every single hire we're about to make, do we have to? And then try to come up with a reason, why or why not.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I beat up all the time when people come to me saying like, hey, I need to go raise funding. I'm like, why? Well, we got to build the team. Okay, why? Well, we need to build stuff. Okay, why? Right? Have you done any of that? Right? And you just keep playing this game. They get pretty annoyed, but by the end of it, they're going, okay, I see where you're going with this. And so often, right, they're missing, right? And this is a really easy example because you're talking about raising funds to spend somebody else's money, which you have to pay back in one way, shape, or another, right? That's money that's now no longer yours, right? You're spending it, but it's not your money, and you have a debt. You now have given up equity. You've given up something in order to take that on in order to build the staffing line. Now, please explain to me cleanly and clearly exactly how that pays back. And the answers usually aren't there. Right. And that's because what they're hoping to do is add people and accelerate things. And I don't argue that will happen. Things will start to happen faster. But the likelihood that they're good things or bad things is kind of a coin flip at that point. It depends on how well the rest of the plan's laid out, right? And typically when I'm talking to people, the plan's not laid out all that well. So what we're talking about is just accelerating towards a potential curve that we're not going to be able to make. And so, we see this all the time, particularly around fundraising. Guys, there's a reason they call it a burn rate, right? It's painful, right? And most of the time, it's tied up in staffing. I mean, we do occasionally see, people take on money to do things outside of staffing, but I would say, yeah, but 70, 80% of it goes towards that team, right? Towards building the product, which is usually team contracting, something along those lines.
Sure.
And so, we see this repeat itself over and over and over again with the same subpar outcomes. And it goes back to what we've said from the very beginning of this episode, is that people aren't considering that hiring is actually a cost and a liability. It is not a measure of forward progress in and of itself, right? If it achieves the desired outcomes, if it gets you closer to your North Star, which, by the way, we will be talking about in our next episode, then you're on the right track, right?
Right.
But so often, so frequently, that North Star isn't there at the time we're making these hires, and we're just like, we just need to get things moving faster, right? Product iteration isn't happening fast enough. Marketing iteration isn't happening fast enough. Throw more people at it, throw more people at it, throw more money at it. And it just comes with this exponentially increasing cost of all the types that we talked about, right? Cash cost, culture cost, management burden, and the rest of it. So this is an area where we have to be super diligent. And as you've said, we might even take it too far. I don't know. But we certainly scrutinize the hell out of each and every one of these decisions. And I can't think back. I'm trying now. I'm trying to think if there's a time where I regretted it, where I was like, we spent too much time thinking about that. We didn't make the hire, and I'm sure that had we done that, things would have worked out better. I don't really know that there's a way to do that. I don't have a crystal ball. But I can't really put myself back in a situation where it's like, man, if only, right? The one that got away, I can't pull one out of my hat. And it's a fairly large hat.
And you don't know, but here's what you do know. And you and I know, and because we have the experience of working with so many founders and working with so many startups. When the startup doesn't end up working out, all those staffing decisions are what you're going to regret, right? All that overhead and all those people who you made commitments to. When we're hiring people, we think about the upside, right? We rarely think about the other side of it. If you've done this enough times, you actually will, because you've had to sit across from a huge number of people and let them all go, right? You won't forget that one. After having a couple battle bruises from that experience, you'll think twice in a heartbeat of let's add people, on spec and see where this goes. So I think, Ryan, all we're saying here is staffing is an important part of every business. Our staff is very important to us. But I think, like with every decision we make, particularly with staffing, we've got to look at this is a massive cost, a massive debt that may not be paid off, that we may not be in a position to make whole. And we have to say, before we make any of these decisions, what else can we do?
All right, so that was fun. But let's actually keep this conversation going. You've heard what we think about this, but Ryan and I would really like to hear what you think. And we're online like all day long, pretty much talking about every startup topic you could think of, from fundraising to customer acquisition to just really how to get all of this crazy startup stuff out of your head. And there's tons of other founders just like you. They're weighing in on these topics, so you'll get a chance to just hang out and meet some really smart founders. We're also super, super easy to find. You head over to groups.startups.com and let Ryan and I hear what's on your mind. Let's get to know each other a little bit, and let's just start having more of these conversations.